Hi, I'm Cindy Porter and I'm a video creator for ColourArte. Welcome back to part 2 of this demonstration on creating this abstract canvas. I have put a link for part 1 in case you missed it in the description box below. Back to where we left off, and I am applying a mix of Bolivian blue and China black vivid ultra enamels using the palette knife technique that we discussed in the first portion of this demonstration. Remembering to apply a very light layer of paint to the back of the palette knife before application. Again, I am using the edge of the palette knife, the thin side, to create indentations into the wet paint that it was just applied. This helps give lots of texture and detail. Using the flat side of the palette knife to make sure that my painting wraps around the edge of the canvas completely. And again, with a little more China black, I am now beginning the horizon line and slowly putting in the detail for that horizon line of the painting. I'm using both the face of the palette knife and the thin edge of the palette knife to create both thin lines and thicker paint applications. And remembering to do the edge of the canvas as well. Putting in those thin line details with this thin side of the palette knife. Using the China black to create those thin line details. As you can see, I'm using the palette knife in almost a soaring motion, as well as a striping motion. To create those super thin lines. Adding some more African jade to the palette before using the palette knife very gently in a tapping motion onto the side of my canvas. You'll see I'm checking that I don't have too much paint on the palette knife before application. It's very important to keep that paint thin on the palette knife when applying it in this method. Making sure that the edge of my canvas is also painted, and using a mix of both the face of the palette knife and the side of the palette knife to create texture and detail. Adding some more Bolivian blue now, and very gently scraping it up that side that will form my trees. Using extremely light touch to the canvas. putting some into the water reflection of the Bolivian blue with the palette knife, and adding another layer of some African jade. Here I'm taking African jade and mixing it with some white gesso to give my sky a coat, using the wide brush and feathering the paint strokes out. I've added some Bolivian blue to the top corner before going over it with some more gesso to begin to form my darker cloud area. It'll need several more layers yet before it starts looking like real clouds. I use the white gesso and African jade mix to give a layer in my water. And now adding even more detail to the water. You'll notice that I'm using the side of my flat brush and wiping it across the canvas so that I get random strokes across the canvas to look like water, using the brush in this method rather than using the full face of the brush. Add a little more gesso into the skyline before grabbing a very thin brush to add some more highlight with the Sunburst Vivid. Just right on that horizon line and around the tree lined edges. I use a dry brush to soften where I've put the Sunburst Vivid. Dry brush just helps you feather out your strokes and soften it off. Now I'm adding some more gesso to that skyline, just creating lots of layers to give my sky depth. I'm now tapping with the gesso, trying to give that soft clouded effect to the sky layers, adding in more of that sunburst highlight. And back again with some more gesso. Take a little Bolivian blue with the gesso and add up to that darker cloud area another layer. I even add a tiny little fraction of China black to that darker cloud area and blend it off. I add a little more African jade back into that tree line because it got a little lost with all that sunburst. And now I'm adding some more lines into the water using the Bolivian blue on the side of my palette knife. Just creating those very thin detail lines for my water. keep adding more and more of those detail lines using the Bolivian blue paint. Little touch up with the brush there too. I'm putting in some vertical lines with the Bolivian blue to my trees at the top, and then some horizontal lines as well with that Bolivian blue, using the side of the palette knife again. Again, touching up just a tiny bit there with the brush, adding some more Bolivian blue and China black to my palette to just adjust my shoreline there slightly. I wasn't happy with the shape of it. Using the China black now and the thin edge of the palette knife, adding more detail lines to my trees vertically and horizontally, just to give them even more detail so they start looking like real trees in an abstract fashion, of course. Adding some to the opposite side of the painting as well. You'll see I use an almost soaring motion with the palette knife, but I am touching very gently to the canvas. There's no pressure applied at all. I'm mixing a little Bolivian blue with gesso just to touch up that edge of the tree line there. I wasn't happy with it, so I blend that off with the baby wipe before going back with the palette knife and putting in some more line detail work. So I mix up some more Bolivian blue and gesso to come back and work on this darker cloud area again. Still trying to get it to where I'm happy with it. Applying quite a bit of paint this time. Trying to get that to look like a real cloud. I accidentally touch the canvas with a dirty finger and grab a paintbrush and blend that off so you can't see those spots I put on, and soften off that cloud edge as well to give it a more realistic look. I give a gentle highlight wash to the whole skyline and then wipe back more at the top, less at the bottom, just to tone that whole sky. I'm coming in now and slightly changing my tree line and adding more cloud detail to that sky. Just adding more and more layers to give the painting lots of depth. Putting a little gesso in to adjust the shape of that cloud slightly. Just putting in fine cloud details into the sky area. Using gesso mixed with the Bolivian blue, the China black and the African jade in varying proportions. Now I'm mixing some Siam white with some African Jade and going to work on the water. Just applying it using the edge of a flat brush again to give those water strokes. You'll notice I'm not painting it all over, I'm painting it in lines in between the work that I've already done, just to give it more depth in the water. Each layer we add to an acrylic painting gives you more and more depth. So continuing to add that Siam white mixed with African Jade. Still using the edge of the flat brush to give those water strokes. Coming back with a little more African Jade. To put a little more colour in some areas. Just trying to get that water to look more realistic and have a lot more depth. I decided I needed a bit of teal zircon on the edge of my canvas. And then I go back to my water. I do tend to jump around a bit when I paint from one area to another. It lets the previous area I was working on dry a little before I go back and do the next layer. It might look really disjointed way to paint, but it's the way I work. So back up to the sky to add in some more cloud detail. Grab a dry brush to fluff it off, but I was unhappy with it, so I've wiped it back with a baby wipe and decided I didn't like a little bit on my water as well and wiped that back. I come back in with the palette knife on the edge for some detail and do another layer down in the water area. I moved the palette knife across the bottom of my water and decided I don't like it. Then I tried to remove it with the baby wipe unsuccessfully, and I tried to use the palette knife and I'm not happy with it at all. So I go back to the drawing board and start again with a fresh layer of gesso and African Jade, and have to begin building up my detail again. So adding the African Jade over the gesso, so a little bit of Bolivian blue in there as well, just a very small amount, and I'm still not happy with what I've done. Still trying to make it look decent, using the edge of my palette knife to give it some texture, but I'm very unhappy with it, so grab the baby wipe and start rubbing back as much as I can to begin again. So African Jade and then some Bolivian blue, and already I'm much happier with how this is coming out. I'm just working that Bolivian blue across to make it cohesive with my design, which involved making some of my water a little bit deeper and darker in colour so that it looked right with what I'd done at the bottom. And I'm taking some African Jade and I'm going back to that highlight sky area to give that area right on the skyline another layer, because the Sunburst tended to give it a really greenish hue, and I didn't want that. I wanted it back to the African Jade, closer to the African Jade colour. Adding some more line work with the edge of the palette knife to give in some more finishing details and a little bit extra depth, and putting back in some very thin lines to where I'd already wiped that paint off. Coming back in and altering that tree line just slightly with a little bit of gesso. Again, just giving some final details to the shape of my skyline and clouded area there. Adding a little more African Jade. Just trying to get that skyline perfect. I come back to my clouded area, my dark clouds, and I'm adding a very small amount of China Black, and now I'm mixing up some China Black, Bolivian Blue and gesso to come back in and try and work on this dark cloud some more. I'm doing a couple of layers of different colours, then a layer of white gesso over the top. You'll notice I don't go quite to the edge, I leave a very thin edge of the darker colour when I went over with the gesso. And now I'm going to rub a lot of that back, and what I'm trying to do is to leave that dark deep edge so that it looks more like a shadow behind the cloud, or under the cloud I should say. I'm adding in some lighter gesso. You'll see I've tried to keep that line still there. And now I'm going to soften it off using a dry brush. Still trying to get that perfect looking clouded area in my sky. Just adding a couple of extra little clouds there, which I was not happy with one of them, so wiped it back a bit. Adding a little more detail to that tree line, this time with a little bit of Bolivian blue, just to give it a little bit more depth. You'll notice that I stop and look at the canvas a lot as I'm working on it. I like to step back from the process and just assess where I'm at to make sure I'm still on track with what I'm trying to achieve. Keep checking my edges to make sure I've kept my sides of my canvas painted in line with what I've done on the front. and here finally is the finished piece. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. For all the details you can check in the comments down below. Thank you very much for joining me and watching this video. Till next time, bye.